Could we just go welcome everyone to the weekly seminar? We'd like to carry on with our routine of letting everyone introduce himself, herself. When we come back to our guest today, Professor Carradine has the virtue of being Welsh, and so I will ask him to say a few words in Welsh when he describes himself.
Bore da, which is actually just good day. My Welsh doesn't extend very much beyond that, but it's very nice to be here, and thank you very much, Roger, for putting me on the spot as a non-Welsh speaker.
Just going around the table either way.
I'm Marion Barber from the National History Center, and as always, I will take this opportunity to ask you to sign in both of the things that are going around the table, the sign-in sheet and that other thing.
Ross Johnson, Senior Scholar, Wilson Center.
Stephen Shore, the PBGC.
Dick Arndt, retired cultural diplomat.
James Banner, historian.
Amy Fickling.
Alan Gulty, Senior Scholar, Wilson Center.
David Block, fan of Richard's from his Oxford College.
Bill Milam, a Senior Scholar here.
Robert Mahoney, retired professor.
Adrian Steffen, retired State Department.
Ken McDonald, former CIA historian.
Don Wolfensberger, Senior Scholar, Wilson Center.
Chris Hale with the AHA.
Tomoyuki Tono, visiting fellow at Center for New American Security.
Phil Hecht, lawyer and fellow alumnus of Corpus Christi with Richard.
Conrad Rausch, University of North Carolina, Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam.
Phyllis Waldman, independent scholar.
Helen Anderson.
Al Schmidt, a retired professor in history and law and visiting scholar at GW.
Arnita Jones, historian.
Larry Headington.
Mel Leffler, University of Virginia.
Phyllis Leffler, University of Virginia.
Dorothy Ross, Johns Hopkins University.
Bob Sutton, National Park Service.
Kesavan, Wilson Center.
James Sang.
AJ Ashiri, historian.
Ronald Steele, Senior Scholar, Wilson Center.
Lance Kasich.
I am Giwon Scholar at Wilson Center.
Songyul Hong, Wilson Center Scholar.
Bryn Stoll.
Donald Myers, attorney and interested observer.
Phil O'Brien at Defense.
Sung, Center Scholars from China.
Kui Liu, Visitor Scholar, Wilson Center.
Ed Britton, I'm a lawyer here in town and an old corpuscle.
Michael Pierce, National History Center.
Okay, I think we got everybody. Roger, go
ahead. Okay, Richard Carradine is the president of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, where he was a student. He then went to the University of Sheffield, where he was professor of American history and dean of the Faculty of Arts, and then he returned to Oxford as the Rhodes Professor of American History at St. Catherine's College. There he managed the rather astonishing feat of persuading his Oxford colleagues that the quality of American history deserved the same status as English history and other parts of the history faculty already held. He is now also, again, the president of Corpus, and many of you will have followed his books on Lincoln and the Civil War. And this afternoon, we get to hear his present thoughts on Lincoln and emancipation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take the lectern so I can see you all. And, can you hear me? Good, thank you. I'm going to move the microphone a little so I can then read my text. How's that? Good. Yes, my title is Lincoln and Emancipation, Presidential Intent at Home and Abroad. On New Year's Day, 1863, 100 days after giving notice of his intentions, Abraham Lincoln steadied his weary hand to sign the Proclamation of Emancipation. In the main, the edict declared free those slaves still in Confederate hands, but for whom the advancing Union forces promised to be an army of liberation. Lincoln's action won him the instant salute of abolitionists, black and white. God bless you for the word you have spoken. All good men upon the earth will glorify you, and all the angels in heaven will hold jubilee. The civilized world congratulates you, and every loyal American responds, Amen. Foreign admirers added their voices to the chorus of praise. European liberals and nationalists led the way. Heir of the thought of Christ and of John Brown, wrote Giuseppe Garibaldi, you will pass down to posterity under the name of the Emancipator, more enviable than any crown and any human treasure. Scores of messages poured in from Great Britain. My fellow Welshmen praised his wisdom and courage. Scots honored and congratulated him. English gatherings from Manchester to London, Birmingham to Newcastle, Southampton to Leeds celebrated this crowning recognition of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Further east, beyond Europe, Lincoln learnt among the oppressed Nestorians of Persia and Kurdistan, the Edict of Emancipation, now translated into Syriac, was prompting hundreds and perhaps thousands to reverence your name. Others, however, then and since, have treated this portrait of presidential moral leadership with skepticism and even contempt, and trenchantly discounted Lincoln's role as the Great Emancipator. During the war, Copperhead dissenters in the Union joined the chorus of Confederates in condemning the Emancipation Proclamation as a tyrannical abuse of executive power and an invitation to interracial slaughter. Their lost cause successors later adopted a reading of equally lofty disdain. Abroad, many contemporaries deemed the edict the desperate action of a Union administration whose incompetence had brought it to the verge of political collapse. Lincoln's own reflections to a Kentucky newspaper that unexpected and unplanned events had controlled his policy towards slavery have helped nourish the idea that the Great Emancipator was merely the accidental beneficiary of wartime contingencies. Federal authorities had little alternative but to accommodate the African Americans who streamed across the lines into Union camps to deem them contraband property to be used in support of the advancing Union armies. On the most polemical of readings, Lincoln was a white supremacist reluctantly forced into glory by the actions of others. Those skeptical about casting Lincoln as the Great Emancipator draw especially on two types of evidence: his stance on the capacities and proper civic status of free blacks, and the presidential policies that he explicitly pursued over the first 12 months or so of the war. On these readings, the racial stereotyping that Lincoln acquiesced in during his debates with Stephen A. Douglas in 1858, when he denied that he favored, and I quote, perfect social and political equality with the Negro, underpinned his hostility to early wartime initiatives to enlist and arm black soldiers. Similarly, his conciliatory Southern strategy, marked by proposals for compensated emancipation and the colonizing of freedmen in settlements abroad, and by overturning the liberationist measures of his commanders in the field, are taken to signal a conservatism and appetite for racial separation that fatally compromised the portrait of Lincoln, the noble friend of the slave. It's not gone unnoticed that when Jesse Benton Fremont journeyed to the executive mansion to speak out in defense of freeing the slaves of rebels, the president told her that the African American had nothing to do with the conflict and should not be dragged into it. Later that year, in August, William Buckingham, the governor of Connecticut, visited the president to present a petition from his state's anti-slavery activists. But before he could utter a word, Lincoln said, abruptly, and as if irritated by the subject, "Governor, I suppose what your people want is more nigger." The historian Elizabeth Pryor has recently brought to light an especially striking example of Lincoln's seeming indifference to the slaves' cause in an encounter with a young cavalryman at about the time of this brusque conversation with Governor Buckingham. Lucian Waters was 24 years old, the son of a preacher and a staunch Republican. His regiment, the New York Volunteer Cavalry, formed part of Washington's defenses and kept a watch on local Southern sympathizers. Waters got a close view of plantations in Maryland, and the experience left him fearing God's judgment on the nation for its damnable, stinky curse of protecting the institution of slavery. Northerners, he told his parents, had to awake from their supineness to save what I hope in the future we may call Great Freedom's Land, but which at present does not answer to that name. Waters assumed that his emancipationist vision and mission enjoyed the blessing of his commander-in-chief, Uncle Abe. In a revealing letter to his parents, Lucian describes how, in early August 1862, he had waylaid the president. Seeking a furlough to go on a recruiting expedition in New York, he handed Lincoln his request for a temporary discharge. The president took the paper and sat informally on the floor of the White House portico, leaning back against a column, his knees drawn up as high as his head. Before reading the sergeant's request, Lincoln looked up and remarked brusquely that the paper had probably something to do with the damned or eternal nigger. Nigger. Waters was shocked by the president's sour outburst. "That spoke volumes to me," he remarked. Here was proof that the president was under the influence of the insidious and snaky influences of Washington's Southern sympathizers. And Lincoln, of course, had no idea of Waters' politics. The cavalryman was offended, but he did not chastise the president, though he told his family he would have liked to have given Lincoln a right smart talking to. But Waters kept a close mouth so as not to jeopardize his petition. Well, episodes like this, of whose authenticity there can be no reasonable doubt, and whose language offends the modern ear, do nothing for Lincoln's reputation. But do they fatally compromise it? How might they be accommodated into a reading of Lincoln that also honors the Emancipation Proclamation as an act of ethical statesmanship, not desperate pragmatism? Well, not by pointing to a simple disparity between public respectfulness and private coarseness. The particular settings may occasionally have shaped Lincoln's mode of expression, but they cannot explain all. In these instances, when Lincoln used disrespectful language is probably of greater significance than where. It's instructive that the most startling of these difficult encounters, those with Buckingham and Waters, occurred during August of 1862. Lincoln was under almost intolerable pressure throughout that month and in early September, the low point of his presidency to date and one of the lowest during the whole of the conflict. His coarse language and brusque conversations, which were out of character, suggest a man under great stress. It's no coincidence that this was when he issued his most commonly invoked statement of the administration's wartime policy on slavery, his letter to the influential editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, published on August the 22nd, just a month before he would issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The circumstances of the letter say much about the political pressures under which he was then laboring. Moreover, its content offers significant clues that are easily misread or ignored about his conception of emancipation and its place in his moral universe. And I'd like to take a look at it. On August the 19th, in the columns of the Tribune, Greeley accused the president of disdain for 20 million freedom-loving Unionists, the population of the free states, and chided him for his lack of vigor in pursuing emancipation. The president's masterly response came in the novel form of a public letter in which he explained his policy. And I'll read it to you, or at least most of it. I would save the Union. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Now, the president's reply to Greeley is often presented as prime evidence of Lincoln's pragmatic unionism, a signal that he was driven less by concern for slaves than by a search for the most serviceable means of preserving American national integrity. And the letter may be seen as the logical culmination of a sequence of Lincoln's public statements since the summer of 1861. At various times, he repeated that his oath of office obliged him to use every indispensable means to preserve the Union, means that under normal conditions would be deemed unnecessary, even extra-constitutional, might in extremis become an indispensable necessity to achieve the lawful end of national survival. Throughout the first year of the war, Lincoln did not see emancipation as indispensable to victory. Recognizing slavery's constitutional protections, he sought to keep the South divided by reassuring slaveholding border loyalists that he was not prosecuting an anti-slavery war. So when General David Hunter issued orders freeing all slaves in his department that encompassed South Carolina, Georgia, and the Florida coast, Lincoln declared the order altogether void. The government had given no military commander the authority to make slaves free, the president declared. Whether it be competent for me as commander-in-chief to declare the slaves of any state or states free was a question which, under my responsibility, I reserved to myself. What Lincoln wrote then in his letter to Greeley had a familiar chime. But by August 1862, the larger political military situation had dramatically changed for the worse. The humiliating failure of George B. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign had prompted clamant demands for a hard war against the Confederacy and its bedrock institution. In July, Lincoln had decided that the indispensable means of national preservation now included emancipation. He told two of the more conservative members of his cabinet, William Henry Seward and Gideon Welles, of his evolving ideas, earnestly saying that he, and I quote, had about come to the conclusion that it was a military necessity absolutely essential for the salvation of the Union that we must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. Lincoln dropped his bombshell at a full cabinet meeting on July the 22nd by reading out a draft proclamation. As commander-in-chief, he ordered, as a fit and necessary military measure for restoring the Union, that on January the 1st, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or states wherein the constitutional authority of the United States shall not then be practically recognized, shall then, thenceforward, and forever be free. Henry Seward urged Lincoln to wait for a military victory. Immediate action, he said, might be viewed not as a great act of humanity, but as the last measure of an exhausted government, our last shriek on the retreat. Lincoln complied and put away his draft, expecting only a short delay. But instead of battlefield victory, the summer yielded only more anguish. A further shattering Union defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run in the final days of August, and Lee's invasion of Maryland in early September. Conditions during the 2 months after the cabinet discussion of July the 22nd were then scarcely propitious for issuing a proclamation. Lincoln was under increasing pressure to do so, with Horace Greeley just one who was badgering the president to act. Throughout, Lincoln discussed the pros and cons of a proclamation with visitors and friends, appearing to keep an open mind. He asked one set of visitors to recall Charles Blondin, who had crossed the Niagara Falls by tightrope. It did not help to be shouted at, "Blondin, a step to the right! Blondin, a step to the left!" Nicolay and Hay, his private secretaries, attributed his growing irritability and what they called his overstrung nerves and species of self-torment at this time to having to be less than frank about his intentions for slavery. Historians have complimented Lincoln on his canny response to Greeley, noting how it allowed observers across the political spectrum to find in it what they wanted to find. The letter reassured conservatives while intimating to radicals that he was preparing for a dramatic step. After all, in saying, "If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it," Lincoln had given his most unequivocal statement to date that he believed he had the constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to act against slavery. And his final sentence, repeating his personal animus against the institution, could be taken as a heavy hint that the direction of the administration's policy. Now, one of the traps presented by Lincoln's letter to Greeley is its invitation to distinguish between the future of the American Union on the one hand and the future of slavery on the other. Lincoln's stated concern for the rescue of the Union appeared to imply his political neutrality on the question of freeing the slaves. Lincoln, however, was no more politically neutral about slavery than he was personally detached. For Lincoln's Union was not a morally neutral political arrangement. Rather, it was a union of values, the values and the principles of 1776 as enunciated in the Declaration of Independence and given protection in 1787 by the Federal Constitution. Within this political framework, Lincoln spent a career devoted to the project of constructing an enterprising, prosperous nation where, protected by the equal application of Republican laws, all citizens would enjoy the right to rise and the education needed to make the most of the abundant opportunities of a fluid and expanding society. As an Illinois Whig and Republican, and then as president, Lincoln had a vision of the Union that remained unchanging in its essential features and its moral direction. At the heart of this agenda were the elements of Henry Clay's ambitious American system: available credit, a protective tariff, and improved communications. Whig and then Republican measures offered the route to a full-blown market economy in which enterprising farmers and mechanics could better themselves as he had done. Southern slavery was the photographic negative of the ideal economic and social order that Lincoln prized. "I am naturally anti-slavery," he wrote in April 1864. "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." The doctrine of natural rights and human equality set out in the Declaration of Independence demanded that all men, black and white, should enjoy the fruits of their own exertions. Free labor held out to the enterprising and conscientious the promise of improvement in condition. It lubricated the social order. Slavery, on the other hand, stifled industriousness and individual initiative, was dead to the claims of personal merit, froze the nation's economic development, and was fundamentally unjust in denying to laborers the reward to which their efforts morally entitled them. Between 1854, when Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the Western territories to the possibility of slavery's expansion, and 1860, when the new Republican Party secured the presidency on the promise of quarantining slavery within its existing limits, Lincoln won a reputation as a single-minded and earnestly ethical opponent of slavery's advance. The Declaration of Independence, in Lincoln's mind, was a near-sacred statement of universal principles and gave secular expression to the purposes of a God who had created all men equal and whose relations with humankind were based on justice. That founding document of the American nation was at one with the book of Genesis. Since humankind was created in the image of God, then the justice of the Creator had to be extended equally to all his creatures, to the whole great family of man. The founders, in Lincoln's words, had declared that nothing stamped with the divine image was sent into the world to be trodden on and degraded and imbruted by its fellows. The Bible's principles were transparent. Give to him that is needy is the Christian rule of charity, Lincoln wrote. Take from him that is needy is the rule of slavery. Lincoln's election to the presidency in 1860 did nothing to reduce his hostility to slavery, but by provoking the secession of the Deep South, did everything to change his political priorities. His chief presidential task would not now be resistance to the spread of slavery, but the enforced reunion of a fractured nation. Yet Lincoln's underlying purpose remained the pursuit of a union committed to values that would ensure the ultimate death of slavery. In a speech to New Yorkers as president-elect, Lincoln set out the vision that had sustained him during his term of office. There is nothing that can ever bring me willingly to consent to the destruction of this union, unless it were to be that thing for which the union itself was made. I understand a ship to be made for the carrying and preservation of the cargo, and so long as the ship can be saved with the cargo, it should never be abandoned. So long, then, as it is possible that the prosperity and the liberties of the people can be preserved in the Union, it shall be my purpose at all times to preserve it. And Lincoln pursued a similar line of argument in a handwritten fragment that dates from much the same time, just before he takes office. The Constitution and the Union are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, something entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. The expression of that principle in our Declaration of Independence was most happy and fortunate. Without this, as well as with it, we could have declared our independence of Great Britain, but without it, we could not, I think, have secured our free government and consequent prosperity. No oppressed people will fight and endure as our fathers did without the promise of something better than a mere change of masters. The assertion of that principle has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. In reading Lincoln's words to Greeley, the sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be the Union as it was, it's essential not to lose sight of the fact that the Union as it was, the old Union, was by Lincoln's definition an anti-slavery Union, a permanent and perpetual engine for the advancement of liberty, a constitutional construction in which slavery was doomed to disappear in time. Equally important, however, was that by mid-1862, this old Union had gone forever, and Lincoln fully grasped this changed reality. And he signaled this in a meeting with border state loyalists at the White House in July, when he again urged them to adopt gradual compensated emancipation. Unprecedentedly stern facts, he said, put loyal slaveholders in a precarious position. Tens of thousands of fugitives were crossing into Union camps, including slaves from the loyal border. Lincoln warned, if the war continue long, as it must, if the object be not sooner attained, the institution in your states will be extinguished by mere friction and abrasion, by the mere incidents of the war. For Lincoln, the new Union, like the old, would be judged, as he declared in his second inaugural address, by its firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. The same understanding of the immutable justice of God that informed his pre-war condemnation of slavery led him during the war to reflect on his own obligation as president to seek and do God's will. Lincoln's Calvinistic frame of thought prompted him to conceive of the Almighty as the ruler of nations as well as of men, to identify nations as moral entities equally as capable of transgressions against the divine law as the individuals who composed them. God's punishment of the nation for slavery, Lincoln frequently reflected, was part of the Almighty's purposes, mysterious and unknown to us. But however mysterious God's purposes and however disobedient the nation, there was reason to believe that a purified union would emerge from the fiery trial of war. Lincoln's Thanksgiving proclamations marveled at the gracious gifts of the Most High God, who had given reasons to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. The dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery, he memorably reformulated this idea in a non-scriptural rhetoric of salvation and renewal. For loyal Unionists, the great task was to resolve that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The final sentence of Lincoln's letter to Greeley is commonly taken to be a hint as to the administration's course towards a preliminary Emancipation proclamation. He wrote, "I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." What generally goes unremarked is how Lincoln here sets the end of American bondage within a framework of universal freedom. Ending racial slavery in the United States was but one element in the larger agenda of human emancipation. The fight to end American slavery was then part of a universal struggle between liberty and tyranny, social progress and lethargy, in which Lincoln conferred on the United States a responsibility to the world at large. His lectures on discoveries and inventions, delivered in the late 1850s, is a crystalline example of his Enlightenment temper, and it announced his nation's role in freeing the human mind from its shackles. And I'll quote from it at some length. "It is a curious fact that a new country is most favorable, almost necessary, to the emancipation of thought and the consequent advancement of civilization and the arts. The human family originated as is thought somewhere in Asia and have worked their way principally westward. Just now, in civilization and the arts, the people of Asia are entirely behind those of Europe, those of the east of Europe behind those of the west of it, while we here in America think we discover and invent and improve faster than any of them. They may think this is arrogance, but they cannot deny that Russia has called on us to show her how to build steamboats and railroads, while in the older parts of Asia, they scarcely know that such things as steamboats and railroads exist. In anciently inhabited countries, the dust of ages, a real downright old fogeyism, seems to settle upon and smother the intellects and energies of man. Progress depended above all on the intellectual ferment, human imagination, and cultural energy that would accompany the world's emancipation from stultifying social and political tradition. Lincoln's horizons stretched across the 19th century world. His declaration that the struggle of today is not altogether for today, it is for a vast future also, and that the Union was the last best hope of earth, were not merely rhetoric. They expressed his fundamental belief that the American Civil War constituted a global as well as an American crisis. The idea that the United States had a special role to play in human history had animated his rhetoric for a quarter of a century and more. The progressive forces in the rest of the world looked to the United States as a unique example of liberty, the fondest hope of the lovers of freedom throughout the world. The nation's mission was to improve humankind. The patriots of 1776 had asserted the right of the people to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world. So for Lincoln, the struggle with the Confederacy embraced, and again I quote Lincoln, more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people, by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its own domestic foes. It presents the question whether discontented individuals, too few in number to control administration, can always arbitrarily break up their government and thus practically put an end to free government upon earth. It was essential to suppress the rebellion, to prove to the world that popular government could be maintained against internal attempts at overthrow, and to keep alive the hopes of Republicans and Democrats everywhere. Lincoln's sense of the Union's historic function as the providential means of liberating humankind, all men everywhere, was nourished by the messages of support that he received from European liberals, Republicans, and nationalists. From their exile in London, Joseph Mazzini, Alexandre Ledru-Rollin, and Carl Blint, refugees from failed revolutions in Italy, France, and Germany, wrote collectively to the president as the war entered its second year. Ever since the outbreak of the fierce contest in which you are so nobly battling against domestic rebellion and human servitude, the hearts of the nations whose aspirations to freedom with which we are identified have not for a moment ceased to be with you. As Republicans, we have felt too well that the rending asunder of your great republic would furnish arms to all the despotisms of Europe. There was a bond of unity between you and us from the beginning of this struggle. In serving the cause of liberty, your cause, we are serving our own. The world, they wrote, stood on the threshold of a new order. Great progress, they said, has been made in Europe as regards the ideas of popular government since 1792, when France unfurled the Republican banner, the banner of universal brotherhood. At that epoch, it was possible still for the oppressors to lead their nations against her flocks in order to reimpose the yoke on her neck. But now, a different feeling prevails throughout Europe. The nations are, every one of them, tired of their tyrants. Italy is up, united in national sentiment, chafing for action, having more than half won her independence. Hungary and the other non-German possessions of the House of Habsburg are ready to follow. The whole of Germany will soon throw itself heart and soul into the struggle with despotism, and France is now awaking from her long sleep. All classes desire thus a change, a revolution, and the sooner the decision comes, the better. The following year, Giuseppe Garibaldi wrote to the president after the Federals' military triumphs at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, "America, teacher of liberty to our fathers, now opens the most solemn era of human progress. And whilst she amazes the world by her gigantic boldness, makes us sadly reflect that this old Europe, albeit agitated by the grand cause of freedom, does not understand nor move forward to become equal to her." Foreign enlistments, too, showed Lincoln how the Union's cause resonated abroad. About a third of the Union's forces were foreign-born. Many of these were volunteers from Germany, Ireland, Hungary, France, Britain, and elsewhere. Take the case of an English boy, Thomas Wolfe, whose parents stopped him joining Garibaldi's forces in Italy, but who made his way to North America, fought in George Meade's army at Gettysburg, was captured, imprisoned, and paroled, and then returned to action with Grant in the Wilderness Campaign. "I'm not afraid to die," he wrote to his father. "I know it is God's will if I should fall under that starry banner that is liberty and freedom." Captured again, he suffered dire deprivation in a Confederate prison, and his distraught father wrote to Lincoln, urging the president to intercede for a lad who, he said, had volunteered through principle to fight for liberty and freedom. Foreign liberals, Democrats, Republicans, and socialists watched events in the United States then with a deep sense of the Civil War's global significance, fearful that the permanent fracture of the American Union would snuff out the prospects of a radical rebalancing of the 19th century world. And Lincoln played an active and largely overlooked role in encouraging foreign progressives. The technicalities of foreign relations Lincoln left largely to his Secretary of State, but the question of overseas popular opinion was another matter. Reports poured in every day to the executive mansion rich in assessments of foreign opinion. From US consuls, Americans abroad, foreign admirers and domestic intermediaries such as Seward and Sumner, Charles Sumner, Lincoln knew how important it was to challenge the constant misrepresenting of the Union's purposes. On the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation, the American consul at Nice lamented that in many instances French minds had been poisoned by the insidious falsehoods of the agents of the rebels, most of whom speak French fluently. I find intelligent Frenchmen profoundly ignorant of our Constitution and the bearing of the question of slavery upon the rebellion. One Robert Adamson told Lincoln about the proliferation in England of so-called Southern clubs that spread misinformation. For instance, that Lincoln had confessed that the greatest folly of his life was the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. John Lothrop Motley complained how diabolic the malice which represents an insurrection to perpetuate Negro slavery as a noble struggle for liberty. The fact was, he told the president, we have the sympathy of the uncounted millions of mankind throughout the civilized world who would be left without a hope if the great transatlantic Commonwealth should go down in this struggle. So Lincoln understood that one of his roles as leader was to rally foreign progressives. Early on, he sent non-governmental spokesmen to Europe as Union propagandists, the Episcopalian Bishop Charles McIlvaine, the Catholic Archbishop John Hughes, and Henry Ward Beecher, the best-known evangelical of the day. One William Dawes came to the executive mansion to propose a mission, as he put it, to enlighten the true friends in England in regard to the wisdom and justice of the measures you have adopted, prompting the president to ask, Mr. Dawes, will you go to Europe? It was a natural request, of a piece with the president's recent overtures to the radical Quaker, manufacturer, and liberal member of Parliament, John Bright, one of Lincoln's greatest admirers in Britain. During the war, Bright engaged in regular correspondence with leading US politicians, Charles Sumner in particular. His speeches argued that the Southern states were fighting for the maintenance of slavery, not independence, and he shot down parliamentary motions that urged recognition of the Confederacy. It's been fairly said of Bright that he, more than anyone else in Britain, was responsible for the positive image of the North and of Lincoln. And the two men exchanged portraits, Bright's being given a place in the president's office. Lincoln wrote out in his own hand a passage from one of Bright's pro-Union speeches. I cannot believe that civilization in its journey with the sun will sink into endless night to gratify the ambition of the leaders of this revolt, who seek to wade through slavery to a throne and shut the gate of mercy on mankind. Lincoln acted then on his fear that Europe might succumb to Confederate spin. Charles Sumner told Bright that Lincoln had been thinking of a way in which English opinion should be directed, and that he, Lincoln, had drawn up a resolution embodying the ideas which he should hope to see adopted at public meetings in England. He thought it might serve to suggest the point which he regarded as important. Lincoln's resolution called the rebellion an effort, unique in history, to construct a new nation with the primary and fundamental object to maintain, enlarge, and perpetuate human slavery, and demanded that no such embryo state should ever be admitted into the family of Christian and civilized nations, and that all Christian and civilized men everywhere should, by all lawful means, resist to the utmost such recognition or admission. Lincoln's domestic speeches frequently invoked the international significance of the American Union, the last best hope of earth. Through his letters to foreign opinion formers, Lincoln reiterated and developed this theme of the global implications of the Civil War. When he told the working men of Manchester that their willing endurance of material suffering in support of the Union was an energetic and re-inspiring assurance of the inherent power of truth and of the ultimate and universal triumph of justice, humanity, and freedom, he was not engaging in mere flattery. And so by these means, Lincoln reinforced his standing amongst European progressives as a man of the people, acting steadily and dispassionately on behalf of democratic government and human freedom. Perfect strangers wrote to him to say how much they admired his noble and dignified conduct under the most trying circumstances that had fallen to the lot of man in modern times. A New Jerseyite, at work in London in 1863 promoting the Union cause, told the President that every Englishman who sympathizes with us was with all his heart for you. I've spoken at several meetings in London and in the country, and the audience have always applauded at the mention of Abraham Lincoln's name. Lincoln's definition of the Union's cause in the Civil War as a struggle for universal, racially blind emancipation helps explain the extraordinary outpouring of grief amongst ordinary folk around the world following his assassination. As well as hundreds of governmental condolences, a blizzard of tributes reached the US State Department from an extraordinary range of voluntary civic groups, churches, secular societies, working men's improvement and mutual aid associations, democratic circles, ragged schools, anti-slavery and freedmen societies, temperance leagues, Masonic lodges, ladies' societies, literary and reading groups, student clubs, gymnastic and choral unions, fire companies, chambers of commerce, and agricultural alliances. Even before his death, Lincoln had become a global figure known in every continent and had touched the lives of common people. Lincoln's international standing would burgeon over the next 2 generations, well into the 1920s, and he would continue to be widely invoked throughout the 20th century in different places at different times for sundry purposes. In these multiple celebrations and appropriations, Lincoln was occasionally deployed in the cause of racial freedom. In Spain, Lincoln was venerated by abolitionist progresistas. In Cuba, as in independent Brazil, Lincoln certainly featured in debates over emancipation. And in India, he would inspire Dalit activists engaged in the struggle to end caste slavery. Yet far more often, Lincoln's freeing of the slaves served as a symbolic element in the larger narrative of the hero of democratic freedom and the emancipation of the world from an old order. When Irish separatists extolled Lincoln for freeing the slaves, they were connecting him with the story of their own national liberation. German socialists, following Karl Marx, celebrated Lincoln for emancipating a class, not a race. Lincoln's purposeful nationalism spoke to a wide spectrum of progressives, of socialists, radicals, and Democrats who combined nationalist aspirations with informal membership of a community dedicated to freeing the world from monarchical power, aristocratic privilege, and constrained popular rights. For them, the nation was the means through which political freedom and individual rights might be universally achieved. Lincoln provided the model of how to transcend one's nation to become a symbol of the common people's universal struggle. In the words of the English poet and dramatist John Drinkwater, Lincoln was the world emancipator, the quintessential 19th century modernizer who liberated the promise of the present from the chains of an ossified past. So to return to Lincoln's letter to Greeley, this was a much more powerful statement of emancipationist principle than many critics judged at the time and others since. Frances Seward, the wife of Lincoln's Secretary of State, complained that the letter gives the impression that the mere keeping together of a number of states is more important than human freedom. But I hope I've shown that the letter to Greeley remains too easily classified as a conservative document constructed around binary oppositions. Its radical significance was not lost on those contemporaries who understood that Lincoln saw the American Union and emancipation as two sides of the same coin. The nation was not worth saving unless it were to be the agent of human freedom. Yet the Union, as the repository of the hopes of all mankind, had to resist an overzealous, reckless abolitionism that would turn temporary fracture into permanent disintegration. Those foreigners for whom the American Union was indeed the world's best hope saw this most clearly of all. 4 months before Lincoln published the reply to Greeley, and just days after the president signed into law an act to emancipate the 3,000 slaves in the District of Columbia, Joseph Mazzini and his fellow radical Republicans wrote to the president in terms that, far from seeing in Lincoln's policy a clash between re-cementing the shattered Union on the one hand and the cause of human freedom on the other, comfortably fused these two elements. Since we have seen the cause of unity and emancipation represented by a Republican as sincere as energetic, they told Lincoln, We have never, even in the stormiest days of the struggle, doubted of your ultimate success. As Republicans, we have felt too well that the rending asunder of your great republic would furnish arms to all the despotisms of Europe, the enemies of the principles we represent, not to have aided you morally with all our sympathy and with all our efforts. In serving the cause of liberty, your cause, we are serving our own. Lincoln may have been less sure of his ultimate success than were his European admirers in 1862, but he was as convinced as they that the Union and emancipation were indivisible as both means and ends in the struggle for human progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cowardine, for this brilliant presentation. The floor is open for your questions. We have a large and diverse and distinguished audience here, so we look forward to
and a friendly one, I hope.
a good discussion. We'll start with Professor Borg. Please, if you could please wait for the microphone. Yeah.
I don't know that I want to play devil's advocate. And so much of what you said is certainly right on the mark. But I wonder if you take the long view, if it is quite fair to meld the nation and principles of universal freedom quite in the same way, the long view of American history. Until the mid-1850s, Lincoln and certainly his countrymen espoused those principles of identifying the Union, the nation, with those universal principles. They're in the Declaration of Independence. They applied them to a slave republic, and a slave republic that in which any steps taken towards opposition of the sort the abolitionists had done and others threatened to disrupt the Union. And they were very definitely intentional. It is really only secession that put the two together and allowed people like Lincoln, who definitely, I quite agree with you, morally abhorred slavery, to take action. It seems to me that in the long view, it's not entirely fair to put them together quite in that way. Lincoln also is very much a politician. That was his vocation for his entire adult life, and he had a very good sense, a very pragmatic sense of how to operate in that kind of a world. So pragmatism was, I think, if you look at some of those steps and some of the things he said, very central to the positions that he took.
I mean, I'd respond to those very fair points in those essentially 2 points. Yes, secession changes everything. Of course, one of the reasons why the Deep South secedes is because Lincoln's interpretation of the Declaration does apply to black as well as to white. Increasingly, the South had turned its back on the Declaration of Independence, stating that Jefferson clearly couldn't have meant to. The Declaration couldn't be used as a biracial document. Lincoln is very clear through the 1850s that it is a biracial document, and it's what leaves him exposed and vulnerable to Stephen Douglas and to Northern Democrats by making this claim, by embracing blacks in that document. And when the South secedes, when the Deep South secedes in 1860-61, it's because they see Lincoln as someone who is moved by a radical ideological position, as expressed particularly in the House Divided speech. So your point is absolutely well taken, but Lincoln's reinterpretation, or rather Lincoln's interpretation of the Declaration of Independence is hugely important. He doesn't, as Doug Wilson points out in his lovely book on Lincoln's rhetoric, that Lincoln drops all reference to the Declaration of Independence in these early stages of the war, because it's such a radical position that he's taking. He comes back to it, of course, later in the war. And then this relates to your second point about Lincoln, the politician, the skilled politician. I wouldn't demur from that at all. And I recognize that my talk, in a sense, almost complete strips out Lincoln, the canny politician, except that the document really is the work of a politician. It's layered. It's speaking to a variety of constituencies. As I say, what I think the interpretation of that letter, or the reading of that letter, has missed is the importance of to see emancipation as a colorblind process, a universal process that embraces white as well as black.
Just if you could please wait for the microphone.
One comment back, and that is Lincoln, when he said, when he drew on the Declaration of Independence, he said at one point, because all men are created equal, doesn't mean that they're meant to be equal in all things and all at once.
No. Yes.
That men are obviously unequal in all sorts of ways. And he talked during the late 1850s, during his campaign, of, well, this might take 80 years, it might take 100 years. And of course, ultimately being free was something that small R Republicans, since even Jefferson had been saying, in the long run, hopefully America would be free. So there is there is again the importance of wartime events and the need to save the Union that brought this to a head, something that even Lincoln, even given these principles, was willing to see only very gradually and over a very long term put into effect.
Well, Lincoln's experience during the war, of course, does shift his own perspective.
Don Wolfensberger.
Thank you. A couple of weeks ago, the District of Columbia celebrated its Emancipation Day, and toward the end of your talk, you made passing reference to the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation for the slaves in the District of Columbia. I'm wondering, how early was he influenced on that count that he could do that unilaterally without a lot of controversy? There'd be controversy, but was he influenced when he was a member of the House, for instance, by the earlier success of John Quincy Adams in allowing for the receipt of the anti-slavery petitions for the District of Columbia? And did he strategize when he issued the D.C. proclamation that this would help pave the way for the larger one?
I think the simple answer to your last question is yes. And of course, Lincoln, as a congressman back in the 1840s, had brought forward a bill to emancipate slaves in the District of Columbia. It was a bill which would have been brought about through compensation. It was a bill which I think helped establish his reputation amongst some of the more radical members of the House, Joshua Giddings. But of course, it was a bill which fell. But there's no doubt at all that by the early part of 1862, when Lincoln has, at that point, already been pressing the loyal border state representatives to think about compensated emancipation, he's proposed a compensated emancipation plan for Delaware, points out that the freeing of the slave, that paying for emancipation in Delaware would cost but a fraction of the cost of the war. I think by March of 1862, he sees he's ready to warmly support emancipation to the District of Columbia. The federal government has the authority to do it, and there is support for it, and it is a signal to the border states that the world is changing. And of course, by July of 1862, he's virtually given up on the border states coming round to a gradual compensated emancipation. By that stage, he feels he's got the border states, the loyal border states, largely within the grip of the military, and something that he couldn't take them on. He couldn't conceive of emancipation in 1861 in the border, but by the spring and summer of 1862 he could. Does that answer your question? Yes, thank you.
Stephen Short, 2 points. It was a wonderful talk, but you've not mentioned that the Union had conservative supporters in Europe, like Tsar Alexander.
Yes.
I think no European government more strongly supported the Union than Tsar Alexander II, who had freed the serfs without any bloodshed. And I think when Grant, after his presidency, visited Bismarck, also expressed similar sentiments that sometimes you have to go to war to, you have to resort to blood and iron.
Yes.
But the second point was that you've not mentioned that the practicality of following so quickly on emancipation, the arming of black troops, which was arguably the decisive factor in winning the war.
Yes. No, both points I completely accept, and I certainly manifestly haven't addressed the extent of support for the Confederacy and the way in which European conservatives, in fact, regard Lincoln as, well, they want to see Lincoln's failure, and subsequently, after the war, during the later part of the 19th century, European conservatives go on seeing Lincoln and American republicanism as a threat. So your point is absolutely right in that respect. Yes.
My point was that a significant portion of conservative opinion of the Tsar, and I think at least, I don't know Bismarck's expressions during the war, but the Union had conservative European supporters even in...
I see what you... I'm sorry. Yes, I think that's true. I'm sure that's true. It's not... of course, it's not true in Britain. That's which is... and the changing reputation of Lincoln amongst British conservatives is an interesting story, which comes about really quite late on in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. We can go there at some later point if anyone wants to discuss it, because I think it's an interesting story. The other point about the significance of black troops and really the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation as a step towards that, well, of course, absolutely true. And for those who are not American historians, first and foremost, by the end of the war, 200,000 African Americans had served in the Army and the Navy. Without that support, one might wonder what the outcome of the war would have been. A hugely important, significant element. Yeah. And a measure, and significant too, I think, in the way in which it brings about, we're talking about changes in Lincoln's reading of African Americans through the war. You compare Lincoln's understanding of where African Americans should be in American society in the late 1850s with what he has come to see by a few days before his death, when he talks about enfranchising the educated and those who have fought in our armies, which is a very different Lincoln from the Lincoln who has had to be very defensive about the status of blacks in the civil and social status of blacks, legal status of blacks in late 1850s Illinois. Yeah.
Thank you. May I perhaps ask a question? I much enjoyed your talk, but you're here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the question I have is, why should we care? Why does Lincoln matter today, especially in this town, especially to the public policy discussion in this town, in this country, especially as you talk about presidential intent of a transformative president?
Well, that's a very small question. Thank you. Why does he matter? Well, first of all, I say I just like to develop one element of my talk, which relates to a book of essays that I edited a couple of years ago called The Global Lincoln, which explains how Lincoln and Lincoln's the reading of Lincoln was enormously important throughout the world, certainly throughout Europe and in much of Latin America during the later 19th century and the early 20th century, with a resurgence of significance, I think, after the Second World War. We could go into that, but I don't think there's any doubt that Lincoln has been appropriated in ways that serve the interests of particular groups around the world, mostly, it has to be said, radical and and progressive forces, certainly only radical and progressive forces in the immediate aftermath of his death. It was a way, celebrating Lincoln was a way of making a signaled assault on the political establishment in a number of European countries. So I think Lincoln's story has woven itself into the story of modernization in Europe and other parts of the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. He has a symbol of a society in which, and of course Lincoln was the personal demonstration of this, a symbol of a society in which an individual could make his way on the basis of his own merits and not on the basis of an ascribed status in a society which was not constrained by monarchy or by aristocratic rights. Didn't mean to say that Lincoln didn't see that there were rich and poor in the societies in which he lived, but it was a society which he believed was very differently founded and organized, and which foreign progressives believed was very differently organized. So Lincoln's appeal across the world in the late 19th, early 20th century is as a quintessential modernizer. It's really important to emphasize that point. What does he mean today? Well, I hope that what he means is that if you, I may tread on some partisan toes here, but I think it's important to explore the nature of Lincoln's republicanism with a capital R. What's his association with modern-day republicanism? Clearly, with modern-day Republicans, he has a vision of an economically expanding and open society. There is a congruence, I think, between Lincoln's economic outlook and the outlook of business Republicans. The Republican Party of the 1850s, however, was the most radical force in the country at the time. It was driven by liberal Enlightenment ideas, and it actually had as one of its major constituent elements evangelical Protestants. But these were very different evangelical Protestants from the evangelical Protestants of today. There were evangelical Protestants in the United States in the mid-19th century who were deeply conservative and who developed a defense of slavery and who sustained the status quo in the American South. But northern evangelicals saw themselves as the motors of progress. They drew on a fusion of religion and science. They saw no contradiction between their religious beliefs and the world of science and education. Many of them, of course, by the latter part of the 19th century, had become liberal Protestants rather than evangelical Protestants. So I think the message would be in Washington today to the Republican Party: look at your roots, remember where you've come from, and it might do you some good.
Thank you. Other questions? Arnita.
Well, I'm guessing with this question that you can't have resisted seeing Steven Spielberg's Lincoln. And I of course, I know, and you know, that many historians have been very critical of the film. I'm really not asking you to parse out those criticisms, but knowing that they're there, and that Spielberg himself has said that he has to write a story, he has to create a story, he isn't being an historian and making his films. My question is, does this kind of film help? Is it useful? Is it harmful? Is it a teaching tool? I mean, what sort of value does this effort have?
On balance, I think it helps. I'd say so for two reasons. I'll preface that by saying, yes, I understand the criticisms that have been made. the criticisms, it seemed to me, are arguably misplaced. This is not a historical documentary. It's a feature film. It's a movie with a story, but a story that is in its key fundamentals authentic. And I think it's a valuable film for two reasons. One is that it does not underestimate the audience's intelligence. It sets out quite a complex political situation where, in order to secure the passage of the amendment through Congress, it's necessary to draw on the support of conservatives and radicals at a time when there are these peace feelers being put out, which cause problems for the executive mansion, the White House. I think that is communicated very well and accurately. Michael Vorenberg's study of the 13th Amendment, the passage of the 13th Amendment, which I think was a book which probably informed the movie much more than Doris Kearns Goodwin, makes very clear the balancing act that Lincoln was involved with in putting together these elements. So in passing, I'll also say that Lincoln devotes more time to this piece of congressional business than any other bit of business in Congress throughout his presidency. And that leads to the second point, which I think it's really helpful to have a movie about the Civil War which puts slavery and emancipation at the heart of it. This was the crux of American history. This was the key issue of the 19th century. This was, and indeed before and since, but it was what the war was about. And while the movie could have done more to demonstrate that blacks themselves played a role in their freedom, I think that Kate Mazur, the historian at Northwestern, has made some telling points about both Elizabeth Keckley, the dressmaker, Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, and is it William Shade or William Slade? William Shade, I think, anyway, he's the butler who hands Lincoln his gloves. These were both involved in black politics in Washington. They were opposed to Lincoln's colonization, to the colonization measures that Lincoln supported, and went on supporting, in fact, I think, to the end of the war. Lincoln is ambivalent about colonization, I think, or at least he's. Anyway, we can talk about that if you want to. But anyway, I think there was something to be explored there, which Spielberg missed or chose not to pursue. Nonetheless, I think in taking an episode of Civil War history rather than doing a biopic or the whole of the presidency was a wise choice. And if you're going to look at a particular issue, the issue that defines the war, then he made the right choice. I myself, as you might infer from what I've been talking about, would say that those months of late 1864, early 65 were a key point, but an even more important period is the summer of 1862. And I think maybe that would have tested the capacity of a screenwriter in choosing that period. That seems to me to have been a period in which, when Lincoln moves to embrace emancipation, as opposed to pushing through an Emancipation Amendment, which would have come at some point or another, if not in that Congress, at least in the following one. I think that earlier episode might have been better. But I actually thought the film was terrific, and it was great. It was a great movie, and let's give credit where it's due. And I think it will do quite a lot for those of us who teach the Civil War.
Thank you. Yeah. Mel Leffler?
Hi, Richard. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'd like to invite you to comment on two different issues. In responding to Christian's comments about how Lincoln resonates for today, you said that his values of an open, expansive economy, providing opportunity for individuals, would resonate with current Republican rhetoric. What I don't think I heard you say is the degree to which Lincoln believed the state was essential to catalyze those opportunities, which would put him at dramatic odds with Republicans today, and I think is extraordinarily important in terms of his overall vision. After all, it was the state that emancipated the slaves to begin with, and that it would not have been done without the role of the state. So I'd like to invite you to comment on that. But the other thing also about the resonance of Lincoln abroad reminds me of the resonance of Woodrow Wilson abroad initially. And of course, we now know how quickly peoples around the world who gloried in Wilson's rhetoric became incredibly disillusioned with him and with the United States very, very quickly for not living up to that rhetoric. My sense is that such a reevaluation of Lincoln and America's role in the world did not happen, that his resonance persisted, and I'd like to hear you comment on that.
No, it's very two very good points, Mel. Yeah, I should have said what was implicit. Yes, of course, Lincoln saw government as an agency as an economic force, as the largest economic force in the nation, at a time when what the nation needed was transportation improvements. What the nation needed was the government to take a lead in a protective tariff. What the nation needed was credit facilities. So his embrace of Henry Clay's American system, which is really what made him a Whig, and his application of Clayite ideas sequentially as a politician through the 1830s and the 1840s, where those three issues do dominate one after another, his political activity and discourse. And his support of colonization is sort of based on the sort of sense that actually that government can involve itself in these great schemes of social change. And then, as you say, emancipation and the activity of the federal government across the board during the Civil War, not simply as through the War Department, but a chase in the Treasury. This is testimony to the power of government to effect dramatic change. So yes, I should have said that. It was implicit. I agree. I think you're absolutely right that Lincoln goes on resonating. Lincoln dies in 1865. In much of Europe still in the early 20th century, Lincoln attracts enormous attention. There's I suppose I know Britain best, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, England. George Bernard Shaw said in 1920-21, when the Lincoln statue, when the copy of the St. Gaudens statue was unveiled in Parliament Square, following a ceremony in which Lloyd George, as Prime Minister, had spoken, and the American ambassador had spoken. The American Secretary of State was there. George Bernard Shaw said there was a cult of Lincoln in the 1920s. Drinkwater's play, Abraham Lincoln, ran night after night in the West. I mean, it's an extraordinary play. It's a kind of grotesque play now when you read it, but it held audiences. The King and the Queen went to see it. This was a statement about a man who had come from nowhere to become the great war leader. I think that's what resonates during the Great War. And then the sense of Anglo-American collaboration in a world where dictatorship is spreading across Europe. And so there is this Anglo-American mission, of which the Harmsworth Chair Oxford, which Mel has held, is an example, really, of that, of the 1920s coming together of Britain and America. So, and again, after the Second World War, but one of the reasons why, perhaps one of the reasons why Lincoln endures, is that he can often be used by overseas audiences to reflect back on the United States. Lincoln can be used to say, Lincoln's values are the values of, these are, the Gettysburg Address. Remember the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln had no, so you're not living up to the full democratic potential of the Gettysburg Address. Or Lincoln had no foreign policy ambitions, no military ambitions. His concern was with the peaceful spread of democratic ideas. And again, that can be reflected back on what critics would see as the abuse of American power. So it's a very different story, I think, from that of Wilson.
Yeah. Richard, could I ask you to, pursuing Mel's point about the initial response and the way in which it played out afterwards, in late 19th century, especially among conservatives, there must have been a quite ambivalent response of Lord Salisbury, for example, because this posed radical changes for British society, but British rule throughout the world.
Yes, certainly, and I think Lincoln's Lincoln remained right through to about 1900. I think the model for Welsh, Scottish. Let's go to Ireland. We'll think about Ireland in a moment, and English radicals. When the writer R.L. Delderfield, known to some of you, when he was born in 1908 or 1909, which is the centenary of Lincoln's birth, his father, who was a staunch liberal, wanted to call him Abraham Lincoln Delderfield, but his mother, who was a staunch conservative, said, "Over my dead body," taking a Salisbury position, as it were, on it. So Lincoln remains a divine. I think it's a measure of influence is how long a figure goes on being divisive. I think Lincoln went on being a divisive figure for really quite a long time after for many decades after his death. What changes, as I was saying to Mel, is what changes things in Britain is the First World War, when conservatives come to see Lincoln and to admire Lincoln for his strong leadership in wartime. For here is a president who knew how to control his generals. Here is a president who gave strong leadership, and so conservatives could therefore warm to that. And could see the positive side of a president who had used power in a conservative way, and not straightforwardly or simply in a way that was politically radical. And of course, it has to be said, I suppose, by the time of the First World War, then the movement for democratic change in Britain has already come on significantly since the 1890s.
Yeah. Thank you. I think final question for Jim Banner.
Professor Carradine, can I bring you back to today? Surely Lincoln is a very protean character and can be used in many ways. And you just cited the way in which he is used to censure the United States. It does seem to me, however, that he could be used in two ways, and I wonder if he still is. For example, his unionism could be cited by the Sri Lankans against the Tamils, the Chinese against the Uyghurs, Prime Ministers Blair and Cameron against the devolution of the United Kingdom. On the other hand, he could be cited, I suppose, by women in Saudi Arabia, any groups that had emancipatory programs and desires. Is that still the case? Do we see Lincoln cited not so much against the United States, but in favor of others' programs and projects abroad?
Well, there are probably others in the room who could answer that question better than I in terms of the kind of current uses of Lincoln. But I mean, what your question poses is, what your reflection indicates is just how the question is what is the legitimate size of the political community? What is the legitimate basis of a political community? You know, Lincoln has been admired, as you say, by those who have actually been would be perceived as separatists on the part of some, but actually as unionists on the part of others. So the classic case, of course, is Ireland, where Republicans and nationalists in the late 19th and early 20th century, the Home Rulers, and De Valera, in fact, subsequently, used the Gettysburg Address as the document that vindicates, that endorses Irish Home Rule. At the same time, Ulster Unionists, or Unionists in the island, and certainly after the establishment of the 6 counties, go on using the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's model as an indication as to the Union has principled value. So Republicans say government of the people, by the people, for the people, if that's the right order anyway. Whereas the loyalists the Unionists in Ulster say, as the Gettysburg Address says, we believe in government of the Ulster people, for the Ulster people, by the Ulster people, under the Crown. And I think, yes, so separatists, you could see, you mentioned China. There are more Chinese biographies of Lincoln than in any other language now. Outside English, of course, but that's a recent development in the last 20 years. And I think it's because Lincoln has got something to say about the holding together of a union. So I can't give you any real current examples beyond that, but perhaps that's enough. Yes.
Thank you. I know our Chinese participants, guest visitors here, were interested in this last remark. Before we thank Professor Cowardin for a phenomenally rich Washington history seminar session, I want to make just a quick announcement acknowledging 2 remarkable accomplishments by my co-chair, Professor Roger Lewis. First of all, completing 15 years of leadership, directorship at the National History Center. And secondly, being recently awarded the Benson Medal of the Royal Society of Literature, which Roger won for his enormous contribution to the English literature, both through his thinking and his support and assistance given to other writers over decades. The award is the Society's highest recognition of lifetime achievement and awarded to those to whom the Society feels have given many years of outstanding service to literature, and past recipients have included J.R.R. Tolkien and Nadine Gordimer. So congratulations to Roger, and I invite all of you to join us for a toast outside with a little glass of champagne. But let's give first a round of applause to Professor Cowardin for a wonderful, wonderful talk.